Hello, and welcome to the Never Ending Experiment. This is episode 12. I'm starting a new software for this podcast. Let's hope it goes well. I think it's going to be a little bit easier. I should really do an episode all on AI because AI is everywhere, and I am slowly starting to learn how to use it and when to use it and to try not to use too much of it. So today I want to talk about psychotherapy. Today, most people call it therapy, which I think is pretty sad, but I'm going to talk about therapy that we all call therapy, which is talk therapy. I do strongly feel that we need to be more objective and more aware of what therapy is. And that's mainly because it is just a conversation. Therapy is a conversation. So, a little bit about my background with psychotherapy. I think the first time that I was in the position to talk to a psychologist, I was around 11 or 12. I was fairly young. And I remember it was a very awkward conversation, and I felt very intimidated. I felt very small, and I was put in this room with a large adult male and told to talk about my feelings. And I found it completely overwhelming and scary. Now, on the other hand, also at that time, I was raised Roman Catholic and I had a very similar parallel experience, which is when I had to do confession around the age of 10. And it was the same thing. You were put in a room alone with a strange man and told to tell him some of your deep feelings and things that I've done wrong. And what's similar about both of these situations is the idea at the very forefront of this is to go into a private session with a total stranger and tell them about your deepest feelings and thoughts and fears. And right there, I think that that's one of the main issues that I have with psychotherapy. It takes a lot of trust to open up with someone, especially to a stranger. I think in some ways, maybe it could be easier because the stranger, in most situations, doesn't have a lot of investment in your life. But I think that that's also a big problem because if they don't have any investment in you and they don't really know what you're like in context, how can they really give you an accurate, view of yourself? So it's a really strange thing that we've, come to accept. And so after those early experiences, I eventually went back, a few times, and I started to lose faith, I think, in psychiatry and a lot of drugs. And I saw a lot of negative consequences for the people around me that were taking some of these drugs. So I was a little afraid of going towards any sort of drugs. But I thought, okay, maybe there's still something to, to therapy. And as I got more into kind of different spiritual things, I thought, okay, maybe there are therapists that are, you just need to find a therapist that's more in line with your own views. Now, that situation also just led to talk therapy too. Now, what's wrong with talk therapy? So I guess the issue with it, and again, is that it is a conversation. So we have conversations with each other all the time. So what is it about a psychologist's conversation that is supposedly better or therapeutic than a normal conversation? I'm not sure that there really is one. A lot of what we use as a measure for how good the psychologist is how much education they have. But does education and reading books really necessarily directly lead to giving better advice? Now, even there, is the goal of therapy to give advice? Because then you would just be an advisor, right? I think that a more accurate term for what so-called talk therapy is would be advice, an advisor, counseling. Counseling makes more sense, but to call it therapy, I think, does a lot of disservice to real therapies or therapies that really do show a concrete positive result. So that's one of the biggest issues that I have is that, so you go to a stranger, you have an intimate conversation with them, and we're told that that is therapeutic. Is it really therapeutic? I think depending on what kind of study you look at, you'll find different results. And of course you would find different results because even in your normal life, you know that there's people that you're going to have a good talk with and you're going to feel better after. And there's other people you're going to talk to and they're going to be negative and critical and you're not going to feel better after. We've all had conversations that make us feel better and conversations that make us feel worse or that don't have much influence on us at all. So that's a high ask of psychotherapy to provide a therapeutic conversation. Now, what could possibly make a regular conversation something that we humans do all the time, that we start doing since we're little babies, to learn to talk? What would make it therapeutic? Well, I'm not sure. On one hand, you could say it's being compassionate, being non-judgmental, being open and listening to what someone is saying. Active listening, where you listen to what someone says and then you reflect back to them if it's really what they're saying so that they feel like they've been heard. Advice, like I mentioned, that's another part of it that could be therapeutic, and just the soothing aspect of someone having a conversation with you. And the other thing is the idea of getting something off your chest, that something's been bothering you, you wanted to talk about it, and you need someone to just listen. Now, that's all possibilities. So, and that's why I'm saying, like, I'm not against having counseling sessions. But I don't think it makes sense to call it therapy, because therapy, I think, really has to be something that is providing you with help. A psychologist may or may not give help to you. So here you are with a stranger, and you don't know anything about their life. They don't know anything about your life. How do you know that they're really the right person to listen to you? So what I found later on as an adult, I think maybe when I was around 19, I went for almost a year, and she did, what is it, EMDR, eye movement. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it has to do with like tapping and closing your eyes. And I found that actually a little distracting, but I think that that was more of what I would consider to be the most therapeutic elements of what I found with psychotherapy, which is visualization. I personally now think visualization and meditation are the best tools psychologically that you can maybe learn from a therapist, but that's not the same as talk therapy either. Now, the idea of visualization is usually that the therapist or the counselor is guiding you through your own subconscious. And I think that can be really beneficial, because what it's doing is it's giving your subconscious the chance to change. Because the trouble is with talk therapy is it's very surface level. You don't necessarily go deep when you're only using words. Now, our brains are complex organs. We have part of our brains work with language, part of them work with hearing, part of our brains work with visuals. So we've got a lot of different things going on. And I think that problem with talk therapy is it's not really accessing those deeper parts of your brain or even your mind-body connection. So talking alone, I think, can be very surface and you can go off track very easily. I think one of my biggest issues with going to a psychologist was how easy it is to go off track. You go into a session and want to talk about one thing and resolve one thing, and suddenly you're getting taken into a very different conversation, and the therapist is talking about something you didn't want to talk about and giving you advice that you can't take. I remember this psychologist when I was younger suggested I get a punching bag, like for boxers, and was going into details about how you can install it and where you can put it in your place. And I'm thinking, like, I don't even have my own place. Like, I'm not going to buy a punching bag. So strange advice like that, I feel like hasn't been very helpful. And it's kind of funny too when they give you homework, because it's like, okay, but I'm paying you and now I'm doing more work. That's confusing. But that's like school, right? You go to school, you pay them, and they make you work. Money doesn't always make things make sense. And it certainly doesn't make sense in that sense. So that's what my biggest question, I think, for those of you that believe in therapy, and there's certainly a lot of people, it's become very popular. And I think that's why anything that becomes really popular, I'm going to be questioning it more, not less. I know a lot of people just like to go with the crowd, and there was a while where I really did recommend therapy, and I did tell people to see a therapist sometimes. And I think when someone says that to you, you know what it means. When someone says maybe you should talk to a therapist about it, it means they can't handle what you're saying. They can't help you. They know they can't help you. They don't understand what you're going through. So it's like kind of giving up. It's sort of a friend's way of giving up and saying, listen, your problems are too difficult for me to help you with, and I'm sick of hearing you talk about it. Maybe you should see a therapist. It's true. It's sometimes you just can't handle it, and you think maybe the authority of the therapist is what will get through to someone. And I think a lot of people do use psychologists' advice as sort of better than the average person's advice. But the thing is, how can you really test that? And since we treat psychologists and psychiatrists like medical and health professionals, you would think that there would be that same level of scrutiny and research into talk therapy to understand it better. But I think that comes down to the fundamental difficulties about how to test what the psychologist or the counselor is even doing. You have things like tone of voice, the kinds of words that they use, even sentence structures, accents, little things like that that are so important in a conversation can easily influence how this conversation will be perceived. And bigger than that too, what kind of questions do they ask? How do they ask the questions? How do they deal with staying on track and focusing on the problems that you want to deal with? I think if you're going to go to a counselor or therapist, you really need to be clear with yourself about what it is you want from them. And what I'm seeing now today is just so many people just going to a therapist over and over and over again, like it's going to be a permanent part of their lives. And you see that a lot with celebrities too, because they can afford it. But I see a lot of people that seem to just think that that's just how you're supposed to live now, is with constant meetings with a therapist just to talk about stuff. And I find that a little weird. I mean, if you've decided to do that and live that way, like, I can't judge you on it. It's your choice. We all have choices of what we want. And obviously, because talk therapy is so subjective, it really is a subjective opinion about whether or not you want to continue. But I think the big issue I have with that is the amount of power that you're giving to a therapist over your life when you start seeing them every week for years on end. That person is now a major part of your life. So you've got to question why you're giving so much power away to this person. And I think that it can very easily get into a kind of toxic relationship, especially if that person is really influencing you to make dramatic and maybe not healthy changes in your life. Now, hopefully, the psychologist is in a healthy place and is giving you good advice to improve how you're doing, because really good advice, I think, should be the mainstay of counseling, where you want to make sure that the advice they're giving you is really good advice. And a lot of times the therapy is the advice that they give, and if you go do those things, then you will have a therapeutic benefit. If they recommend that you exercise more, that's therapeutic. If they recommend that you go outside more, that's therapeutic. If they recommend that you eat better or you're more careful with your relationships. Now, the relationship part of it is a really big one, because the therapist-client relationship is a relationship. So the more that they influence your relationships, they're also in a relationship with you. So that kind of makes it contentious too. And the thing that worries me is when you see that counselors are influencing people to break up with a lot of their other relationships. And I think that connects to cancel culture a lot. And I think I talked a bit about it before. Like, I'm not comfortable with sort of celebrating cutting people off. I think that sometimes you do need to cut people off, and that's absolutely true. Like, we all have a limit to how much we can handle with other people. But I think it's dangerous if suddenly your therapist is recommending that you talk to them more often and they're asking you for more money, while at the same time influencing you to shut more and more and more of your other relationships out. That is turning into an abusive relationship and can turn kind of cult-like too. So I've seen that happen, and I do think it's something to just be careful of. I think most of the time what makes sense to me in terms of like why you would see a counselor or psychologist is, you're having specific issues. You want to deal with them and you want someone to help you get through to the other side. I think I saw a psychologist for around a year, and at the end it was like, I don't really know what we talked about. I don't know, like, it seems like these conversations that you have with a psychologist can be really, really nebulous and vague, and I guess kind of philosophical, which is okay. It was almost like I was remembering just these sort of boring, okay conversations. And I think what it did too that disappointed me is that it made me feel like I should just give up. Just give up on the issues, just give up on what was troubling me, stop fighting back, and just kind of, just be whatever. And I don't know, like, I can't come out with like a hard yes or no whether it was even helpful. In the end, I wish that I'd had the money and time back, but maybe it did help, and I don't know, because it's very hard to compare it if you're having a situation in your life that's unique. You're not going to have another situation like that, so how can you even compare it to anything else? You can feel better right after talking to someone about your issues if they give you that sort of feeling of like things are going to be okay. And that's a lot of what it is, like, oh, it's okay to be this or be that, and getting that non-judgmental kind of perspective. You can feel better right away, but a week later, 2 weeks later, do I still feel better? Not really. So what is the therapeutic benefit? I'm genuinely curious. I think if you're studying psychology, especially, or if you're involved in research, I think that's something that I would really like to see delved into more, because right now I think the way that a lot of the research goes is to examine specific psychological philosophies, but I think this goes well beyond philosophy. I think you really need to look at the nuts and bolts of how we talk and what kind of speaking actually gives people a therapeutic feeling, or what kind of advice really works. There's a TV show out now, Shrinking. I think it's called Shrinking. And that was really entertaining. I haven't seen the newest season, but the first season I thought was really great because it really does bring to light what psychology is, what therapy is, and how the therapists themselves manage their lives. And a lot of them have crazy lives. A lot of them are not normal people. They are attracted to psychology for a reason because they've often had psychological issues themselves, or they've seen it in the people around them. And so they know how powerful the mind is. They want to work with it. But I think that the biggest trouble with a lot of the therapy is for the counselors themselves, because they have to take on so much. A lot of them work with criminals or people who have done really bad things, or they work with victims of terrible abuse. And so they have to listen to some really dark and sometimes very scary things. And, sometimes people will share thoughts that are disturbing to them with a therapist that they don't necessarily share with anyone else. So that's a lot to take on. And that kind of comes back to the whole tradition of shamans. And the shamanistic tradition is more overlapping into regular medicine and psychology. But the shaman has a lot expected of them, that they are the ones who go into their own subconscious to help you with your subconscious. It's a very active role and very demanding. And I think a lot of people that are a lot of therapists that get into it, if you really think that talk alone and analysis alone is going to help, I think that that's kind of a bit naive, because I think it does demand quite a lot of the therapist to have to listen to what a lot of these people are saying and then be able to process it. And you can suffer from, the secondary effects of trauma by being around someone who's been traumatized for a long time. And if you imagine this person is seeing patients day in and day out for hours at a time, just hearing a lot of negativity, you can see why they would react to that. And I think from what I've witnessed of a lot of psychologists is what I've seen is people kind of being very reactive, which is the exact opposite of what you would want in a therapist. And you expect them to be this calm, cool, tranquil presence that can just handle anything. But that's not realistic to expect that of another human being. That's like some saintly behavior that's quite rare. And you can't learn that in school. The schooling is very intellectual, very analytical. I mean, the whole psychoanalysis tradition is very recent. I mean, Freud was around not even 100 years ago. So before that, there wasn't really what we have now of this sort of talk therapy, that was something that Freud created, and it suddenly spread and got bigger and bigger and bigger and modified a lot. Most people today would not use Freudian psychotherapy because it did not have good results, but yet it became very popular. So that's another thing to think about. How good are the results of therapy? So from what I experienced with myself and seeing how it influenced me, I think it kind of broke down some of the boundaries that I had or some of the barriers that I had, maybe too much. And I think sometimes when you get talking about your problems, you keep talking about your problems and you will start talking to other people in the same way that you talk to your therapist. And it's just like this sort of verbal diarrhea. And it doesn't always give you any positive feedback either. It can really scare people when you're going through a time like that and you're giving them this information that you've delved up when you've talked with your therapist. And now it's even more uncomfortable and the people don't want to hear it even more. So we are in a strange relationship collectively in a lot of cultures now because psychology and talk therapy has become so commonplace and has become so widely accepted. I do go into this quite a bit in my book, Dreaming Life's Language, which should be out soon. But the other thing that I noticed that I didn't write about in my book that I've kind of noticed with people is I've noticed that it can make people very self-involved and even selfish. One thing that really shocked me when I was doing counseling is the counselor gave me advice to ask for more in my relationship. And I just thought that was so strange because I ask for stuff all the time. I have no issues asking for stuff. And I thought that was just strange advice to be encouraged to ask for more. But I see that a lot with people that do therapy is they really get selfish. And I think that's partly to do with what I mentioned before, that the therapist doesn't see you in your normal life. You don't see the therapist in their normal life. So how do they know that what you're even telling them is true? And lying is a big issue, I think, with psychology, and especially in those situations where you're seeing a psychologist in order to get an assessment. Because if you're getting an assessment and you know what you want that assessment to say, you'll say whatever it takes to convince a psychologist that you are either, whatever it is, whatever qualities you think that they need to see in you. We're actors. We can all act. We can all lie. So the opportunity for lying to therapists is very strong. And so you're giving them a false narrative of what's going on in your life. And they're giving you advice to be even more selfish. Well, if you're already a selfish person and this therapist is giving you this impression that you're not, you're going to get really, really in a lot of trouble with other people because you may not understand how selfishly you've already been behaving because the therapist doesn't talk to the other people. Now, there's another kind of counseling that goes into couples counseling, and my experience with family counseling is that it's been really disastrous. And I think that it's because what we really want when you're having a conflict with someone, you just kind of want someone like an angel to come in and be like, this is how it is. You're wrong. You're right. This is right. This is wrong. And you don't always get that with psychologists because they really don't know who's right and who's wrong. And they don't come in and save you. I heard a psychologist said, she basically said, I don't care if you guys have no contact with each other after this. I don't care if you still connected to each other. And I was like, wow, that is cold. That is like, what is the point of counseling with people in a relationship if the therapist doesn't even care if you're still in a relationship at the end of it? And I thought, well, that seems pretty contrary to the whole point. Other psychologists, he has said, is that he doesn't think happiness is important. What is the point of going to a counselor if they don't want you to be happy? That's bizarre. I would think that happiness is the main goal of psychotherapy. You're going there to feel better, not to get smarter. If you want to get smarter, go to school, read something. But if you want to feel better, you would think that going to a counselor or a psychologist is the way to do that. So to find out that a lot of psychologists don't believe in happiness and don't think that that's a good goal to have, well, what the hell is the goal? I don't know. I would definitely not want to go to a psychologist that doesn't think happiness is important. Now, you hear a lot about self-awareness or self-realization. Well, what the hell is that? I don't know what that is. Do you know anybody who's self-realized? Do you think that that's really great? I know if someone's miserable, I don't want to take their advice. I don't want to follow that road. I don't want to be like them. And a lot of those miserable people are lacking in intelligence, and they're lacking in the ability to think in a healthy, productive way. Health and happiness, I think, are very directly connected. If you're feeling physically good and mentally good, and you will be happy. You're not going to be happy bouncing off the walls 24/7. Nobody's like that. But a calm and serene and peaceful life is generally connected to general sense of happiness. So it's something to really think about. What do you want out of therapy if you're going? How are you going to get out of the therapy if it's not going your way? Because a lot of psychologists are really good at getting you to come back over and over. So my opinion overall of therapy, psychotherapy for me now is I avoid it. I don't really see it as something that I would want to look at. However, I think that psychological research is really, really important. So I think it's something that we need to get better at. And there probably are certain situations where having a psychologist around would be a good thing. Nowadays, as I'm getting more into psychedelic research, I know that having a therapist is becoming more common. So a lot of psychologists and counselors are recommending psychedelic therapy, and sometimes people are doing these kind of sessions with the psychologist or therapist present while they are going through a psychedelic experience. And that can certainly maybe be the right way for you. I think for me, being alone, I think is more helpful, and just knowing that someone is around just to watch out for you, for me, is good enough. I am a very independent thinker, though, and I always have been, but we all need each other sometimes. So I guess what I'm hoping to see is more in-depth analysis of what it is about conversation that may be therapeutic for people. And that would actually make it a lot simpler, so we're not wasting so much time on, unnecessary conversations that aren't really helpful. So there's a lot of questions to ask yourself. How much power are you giving to this person, and why? And then, check in with yourself after. Is it really helping? Is it really making your life better? Because if it's not making your life better, then you might as well just have conversations with your friends. So, yeah, I hope that we get smarter about psychology, and I hope that we learn more, because I think having an advisor who gives you really good advice and leads you into the right kind of therapy for you would be a really excellent thing. But to imply that the conversation with them alone is the therapy, I think is a bit of a lie. And I think that we need to kind of question how we label people and how we look at it, and also to see what the overlap is with shamanism. Because if we look at the history of psychology in the Western tradition, it's only, 80 years old. It's not an ancient art form. It's not something that's been truly tried and tested over a long period of time, like other kinds of medicine. So if you're in a position you're looking at doing therapy, I think just keep in mind that it is a work in progress as far as what the benefits are and how that's supposed to work generally. I would love there to be more in-depth knowledge, and I think the problem of why research is so hard in psychology is because psychology involves ephemeral emotions that come and go, and they involve a lot of abstract thinking, and they involve a lot of metaphor. When people go through a lot of trauma and difficulty, often they get more into a metaphorical, inward way of speaking and seeing things that can be very confusing for people outside of that. And it's also very difficult to test for what those things mean, things like dream work, which I'm working a lot with now. Dreams can be very difficult to interpret, and they can also be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So psychology itself is not a reductionist field. It is something that is more expansive and often involves many different things. And we have to get out of the idea of that psychotherapy is a cure for troubles that you've had. It may or may not be, and I think we need to be more open to learning more and pushing into new directions to really see what can be the most helpful for people and be a little bit more objective about something that's very subjective. So it's not easy to do, but I would like us to get a little more clear collectively, and especially when it comes to research, about what's working and what's not working. And that would also make it, I think, a lot easier for psychologists too, because it's kind of a dangerous profession if you're not really healthy in yourself, because you can get very depressed listening to people tell you their troubles all day. So we need a way to make it healthy for everyone. And yeah, for something that's so popular, I think we should know a lot more about it. That's all I have to say today for therapy, and I hope you join me next time in a couple weeks. I'm also starting Never Ending Discussions with my friend Omar, so look out for that as well. I'm just going to have that on YouTube, and I'll continue on with this podcast. And please subscribe and keep listening. And thanks for your time. This is Kim Anderson, Never Ending Experiment. Thank you.